You'll want to have your Bible in front of you with a table of contents. So if you want to grab one maybe that you brought with you or from the pew in front of you, we'll be referencing that table of contents toward the end of our time here together. And I'll be surveying the same basic ideas week after week, so hopefully pretty soon you can just predict what's going to show up on the screen in front of you, right? So we've reminded ourselves there is a God, and God does speak. He communicates, but he communicates in a specific way. He communicates with words, verbally. Hi, Dave. He communicates in clear way. Actually, Hayden, do you mind turning off the front chandelier lights? Thank you. God speaks in words, not just in vibes or emojis. He's very explicit and clear. And he does that even today. God is not just an ancient God who shows up in stories of religious accounts and encounters in the past. He is a God who speaks today. He continues to preside over creation. You and I woke up this morning not because we're very good at waking up, but because God is kind to us. He gives us life and breath every day. The earth continues to function seasons. So many of these systems are consistent, and the cycles are in place, water cycle, wind cycle, what have you. God is stable in his preservation of the world, and he speaks to us today. And then our last really simple thought is really meaningful. In contrast with other religions that say you have to learn Arabic, for instance, or you have to go to the originals, we can be confident that God is speaking to us today in our own language. And I'm so grateful for that, for his wisdom, that he is a universal God. He is one who speaks to all languages and all eras so that everyone can understand his word for us. And I'm grateful for his wisdom that way. Let me mention a few other resources here this morning. The one on the left, What Does the Bible Say About the Bible? It's a short booklet. I have a copy at the house, and it's a very simple overview of this whole process. The one on the right is, if you're a nerd and you really want to go into deep study, it's called Canon Revisited by Michael Kruger, and he just walks through how can I know for sure that the books of the Bible should be in the Bible, is one of the questions he has. What I have here, just to mention in person, is that middle one called A Visual Theology Guide to the Bible by Tim Challies, and he's a big graph guy. So the Canon Revisited one is for those of us who are nerds. This is for those of us who are geeks. And we like the data, we like the overview, the big picture stuff. But he has really a lot of helpful charts and graphs to help us survey the different sections of the Bible. I really appreciate he has some very vivid displays showing how the New Testament, and specifically how many ancient copies of the New Testament we have compared to other ancient works. And really just grows your faith when you review this. So if you want to look at it on your own or pick up a copy for yourself, it's well worth it for sure. I'll survey where we've been as well before we jump into this next step. So up until now, we've talked about the idea that God reveals himself generally and then more specifically in Scripture using words. And then we've spent 2 weeks looking at the idea that God speaks actually in the Bible itself, inspiration. And when God speaks in the Bible, we can understand it. And that means this Bible is a very special type of book. I mentioned that you would want to use the table of contents. Why don't you look at it with me here? And we're going to just observe what we see on this table of contents. You're going to see two parts to the Bible. And the first part is considered the old, the first section. It's not really divided in half. It's more like 3/4. The first 3/4 is this Old Testament, and that's describing and summarizing the era covering from creation all the way through the time of Jesus, focusing on the Jewish people, but really focusing on the Jewish people as a stage for world history, for God, how God introduces himself. And you see a lot of names and different titles of books. If you were to look at that, you would see how many total books show up in that Old Testament section. I'm seeing up to 39 books, most likely. And then in the New Testament, this is written at the beginning when Jesus is born. It's about 2,000 years ago. And, well, I'll show a timeline here in just a moment, but I just want us to appreciate here, I'm seeing 27 books. And the books in the Old Testament are generally longer, right? So the first book of the Bible is Genesis. You would see it has 50 chapters. In the New Testament, though, the longest book is Matthew with 28, and Acts as well have 28 chapters. But the Old Testament, it's more bulk, more material, more history. New Testament is more recent, and that was written in a very short amount of time. So when I say the Bible is a book, I suppose we could also say it's not just a book, it's actually like a library. It's a collection of books. And we'll look at that picture here in just a minute. But I want us to appreciate this as we go through this. On the one hand, our Bible, because it is written by humans, by people, right? It wasn't just magically revealed and someone discovers it. Humans wrote it down, and it was compiled and recognized as from God, but slowly developing over time as God spoke to more and more people, more and more prophets. Their list of books that are from God got longer. It's a historic document, historic record of God's interacting with other people. So on the one hand, we say it's a human book because it's written by humans, but on the other hand, it's not just a human book, right? These humans wrote as God instructed them and directed them, and as they were recording their own experiences or the experiences of others. Luke, for instance, we'll talk about later on, he does interviews with people to make sure he gets the facts straight from the accounts of Jesus. What we're having then is a unique book that's human and divine at the same time. And now we're going to start zooming in a little more, not looking at the Bible as a whole, but more specific sections of it. But I just want to appreciate again, there's a uniqueness to this book. And also because it's a human book, it has sections that are poetry, and I'm going to look at it as poetry. It has sections that are stories. I'm going to read it like stories. And I just want to appreciate all of these things. This week and then the next week or so, perhaps 2 weeks, we're just going to look at this question. How do we know what books should be in the Bible? Some people may have a question about that. There are a lot of names here. I'm seeing 66 total books in my table of contents. And I'm not a skeptic, but a skeptic could ask, are we sure these are the right 66? Are there really just 60, and then we threw a couple extra human origin type of books in here? Should there be 67? People could have questions about that. I'll touch on that this week, and then in 2 weeks we'll continue that conversation. But that's what we're focusing on now. And in the future, later on, we'll start zooming in on the words themselves. How to know that the words in the books are the right words. I want to make sure that the words I'm reading in my page match the Greek and the Hebrew and some Aramaic that God originally inspired in these writers. And that's an important question. And once we answer those questions, we're going to conclude again, we really can know that what we have in front of us is God's word for us today. So on your handout, you're going to see, I'm kind of surveying where we've been. And I'll just do a quick comment about this term canon. Is kind of a technical term, the canon. Originally, it's meant like a standard of measurement. Think of like a reed was considered a canon at one point. And so we say the canon means do all these books of the Bible match this standard of being from God? Are they accurate? Are they inspired by God? Are they accepted universally as from God himself? And then it's just used to describe the collection of the books of the whole. So when we say the Old Testament canon, does mean that Old Testament collection of all those books of the Old Testament. If you were to divide the books of the Old Testament into categories, what categories do you think you would come up with? Okay, books of Moses is a clear one, definitely. Mm-hmm. So some history books, poetry books. And then some prophecy, the prophets, yeah. This graphic is a helpful illustration of this. And again, this will match some of the books you have on the table of contents in front of you. This is a slight adjustment from what we would see in the Jewish layout. They would kind of rearrange a few books in their bottom two shelves. But on the left bookshelf, you're going to see those maybe different categories of books that we'd find in our Old Testament. That top shelf is called the law shelf. Moses is the one who has written all 5 of those books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And you may want to keep your table of contents open and just compare and make sure, okay, I see those 5 are in that shelf, right? So Genesis through Deuteronomy have been written by Moses. When were those written? At what point in the history of Israel were these 5 books written?
Sometime in the wilderness.
So they've come out of Egypt, and essentially they need a clear national identity. And it's very likely the case that specifically Genesis, which happened before they came out of Egypt, the stories from Genesis have been preserved through oral tradition and God the Spirit confirming with Moses, this is the accurate way of saying this. Adam would tell the story of what happened at the fall to his grandkids. Kids, don't talk to snakes, right? Now, there's more than that. But he would just repeat the story, the accounts, the details. And so the flood accounts, really almost every society has some version of a flood account, of a flood that came and wiped out all humanity, but there are a few survivors on a boat of some kind. And so Moses kind of records that for the first time written. And then, in addition to the history of their people, he's going to help them develop an identity of their people. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are all about coming out of Egypt, beginning to develop a clear constitution under God as their Lord and their ruler. And the Jewish people, as they summarize this, they call this the Torah, the law, given by Moses at the beginning. That next shelf down is what we call the writings. The Jewish term here is the Ketuvim. And so the Ketuvim would be these writings that are recording everything. And the Nebi'im, the bottom one, is like the prophets. But you see sections of that writing. I'll just focus on that shelf that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. Some of these are history books. What's the history of Israel, right? So if you look at the shelf or maybe look at your table of contents, what books of the Old Testament are stories? Again, I just want to make sure I'm familiar with these things. What are the stories that I'm seeing? So I'm seeing Joshua here. It says Joshua, believe it or not. Through 2 Chronicles, these here are recording the history of the Jewish people from entering Canaan all the way through. 2 Chronicles ends with them coming back from exile like 400 BC, like much later. That's a long history. 1,500 years, or 1,000 years or so, represented here. And Kings and Chronicles, they're covering the same era of history, but they're giving different emphases and they're written for different audiences. We'll touch on that here in a moment. But we want to appreciate that we can read, and usually these are some of our favorite stories because those are our favorite chapters to read because it's easier, right? I'm reading the story about Joshua. I'm reading a story about Samson. I'm reading a story about Samuel and David or Solomon. A few other books are describing what happened after they returned from exile. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And those are, so when I look at my English Bible here, the table of contents, all those history books are clumped together. Joshua, all the way down through Esther, are essentially history. And then we get to the poetry section, and that's the books kind of stacked up here that you would see. Job is written essentially in poetry, but it's recounting ancient history as well, likely from the time of Abraham. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, these are all books that are poetic, and they're trying to make sense of life in this world. How can I live a right life? What are the patterns of living? Proverbs is very practical. Ecclesiastes is a really rich book, written by Solomon toward the end of his life, kind of imagining what would life look like if there is no God. And he really just comes to pretty bleak conclusions, honestly, in Ecclesiastes. Psalms, you may recognize, a lot of Psalms are short hymns. They're the hymn book of the Jewish people. And then starting in Isaiah, which Isaiah shows up I think this is Isaiah. It's hiding, right? Oh, okay. Michael's cheating. He found a picture online. He's looking at.
No, I haven't lagged onto it.
Nice. So Isaiah, through the end of the Old Testament, these are all individual names, people who are prophets. And they are prophesying during these time periods. So during the times of the kings is when these prophets are all giving their oracles, their message from God. And we want to appreciate that. So in one sense, when I see here in my Old Testament, it's not completely chronological, because, it is, because Genesis is the beginning, right? And Malachi is the last prophet. But these prophets are all writing during this time period. And so if you've ever tried reading the Bible, they call it a chronological schedule, you'll read some Kings and Chronicles, and they'll pause and have you read the book of Isaiah, for instance, because it covers the era of that king. And then later in Kings, you're going to read a little bit more, and you'll pause and flip over to Ezekiel or Hosea, because they're writing about the era of that king. I just want to help us get a sense of this, the Old Testament canon in particular. Okay, we'll take a quick moment, and we're going to jog through history really, really quickly. But I want to give you a chance to try to see if you can put this timeline in order. You can challenge yourself this way. What do you think, as you look at your paper, you're going to see a timeline 2000 BCE up through 0, which is a key hinge point. And you're going to see 5 different letters, A, B, C, D, E, and 5 names. You think you could try to put all those names at the right spot? Who shows up when? That's the question that I'm going to see if we give us a Jeopardy moment to try to answer. So if you want to discuss with those next to you, see if you can identify those, put them in the right order. That will help us as we consider this timeline a little bit more. All right, so what are we thinking here? So we're going to try to, let's go E through A. Let's start with the letter E. 0, that's probably the easiest one. Okay, who's the most recent, right? We'll start there. The most recent, what were we thinking there? So letter E is Jesus, right? And obviously these are estimates. You're not going to say, Pastor Andrew, this is a millimeter off. And we're saying this is just a broad timeline, right? Well, it can be confusing. Yeah, well, and especially because you have it's like a negative and a positive, so it can be kind of confusing. Yeah, God the Son was first.
Yeah, he would be off the scale.
Technically, yes. That'd be an array, right? The arrow pointing in that direction infinitely. So letter E, we're going to say is Jesus. Let's go back to letter D. This is about 500, 400 years earlier. Who shows up at that point? So Daniel, Daniel is alive. Oh man, there's so much I could share, but the timeline of Israel is essentially a stock market that gets lower and lower. It goes like this, dips, and back up, and here. So kind of low, high, dips, and up a little bit. And this right here is where Daniel would fall into place. What about before him? Letter C, about 1,000 or so.
David.
I'm thinking David, which means I'm going to go back. Letter B would be Moses, and then before him, Abraham. Right? Oh, that was... Of course, when I copy-paste from one program to another, that doesn't show up. But yeah, that's the order anyway. Abraham at around 2000 BC. And then Moses leading Israel out of Egypt, 1496 or 1486, excuse me. Would be the best estimate there based on the chronology, the history of the Egyptian pharaohs. Really tremendous discoveries there. And then 1000 is when David was reigning, Solomon, and there are actually specific time markers in the New Testament given for that, for when Solomon is reigning, around 1000. And then David at 500, Daniel 5 or 400, leading up to the time of Jesus. But I want us to have a sense of this because what we'll just talk through, just again, jogging through history, just realizing that over time, the Jewish scriptures were having more and more books and revelation added to them. Now, granted, it's when Moses is writing at 1500, up to Daniel or Malachi is the last prophet around 400. That's a 1,100-year process of more revelation from God as their history goes on. But it's still meaningful, and what we want to appreciate is every time they had that prophet's message or that record of Israel's history, everyone recognized we need to salvage this, and this is a record of God's working with us, and we need to take this record as like accurate and historical, and this is God's message that we need to learn from. So we'll summarize this. Oh, I thought this was one line at a time. It is not. Well, you can see the same thing on your paper anyway. Moses records the history of Israel. He writes the words of God. And so at this point, God is telling Moses, write down these commandments. Write down this record of what's happening. And then Joshua is given a book to remember. Exodus 17:14. Moses, write down this story for Joshua so he can remember it. And he has the Song of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy that the whole nation is intended to remember and actually to memorize. We haven't touched on this, but in human history, not everything had been recorded, right? There was a time when they began to write things down. But before that, they still had a consistent way to remember and rehearse the truths of their society, of their history. And the oral history is very significant, right? We think today it's like a telephone game where I can't take it very seriously. One person said to somebody else, here's what happened, and how do you know it didn't change from one person to the next? But I want to remember a few things. Number one, when they would recite this, it was not one person to one person. It was a whole community that had all memorized and remembered these facts. So one person recites, kind of the community storyteller, everybody knows the story. And they're all going to fact check that one person. And it was rehearsed in a way that people could remember and pass on. And the human mind is astoundingly capable of this. We're not so much inclined toward memorization today because we have access to written records and books. But this is something that Joshua needed to remember, and others as well beyond him. But even in that writing of the book, they said, here's something you need to memorize. Rehearse this song. Judges and Samuel, we already mentioned that they're giving the history books of Israel leading up to the time of David. And then David and Solomon, this is when many of the Psalms are written and they're expressions of praise to God. And David acknowledges, when I'm speaking, it's God putting these words in my tongue. And he is worshiping God, reflecting on the laws of Moses, how he loves God's law. He valued the books of Moses because he recognized those to be true. And Solomon as well contributes the Proverbs. The Ecclesiastes is his reflection on life under the sun, we'll call it. And we already said the prophets were ministering during those times of the kings. But what I find really meaningful and helpful is to consider those last two lines there. You have the books of the kings. I'm sorry, let me back up. The timeline of Israel's history is where they have a kingdom under David and Solomon. And then shortly after that, the kingdom starts to erode. It goes downhill. And the people are wandering away from God, who's redeemed them, brought them out of Egypt, claimed them. You think they'd stay loyal to God, and yet there's this appeal of the other gods around them. And so God warns them, if you continue this pattern, then I'm predicting what will happen. If you wander from me, then you will be punished. You will be exiled from your land. And Jeremiah predicts for 70 years. Now, Jeremiah gives that timeline after they've been in exile. But imagine if you're a Jewish person and you're thinking, I thought God loved us. I thought we were his special people and he was salvaging us and using us to tell everyone about the Creator God. But now it looks like God lost because I've been kicked out of my homeland. And I'm living in exile in another place with other people who don't fear God at all. How can God be in control? The book of 1st and 2nd Kings is written for those people because they're asking, how did we get here? What happened? And in that account, Kings is saying, here is a record of God's warnings to his people again and again and again. And you read through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, you're going to see a constant pattern. This happened to fulfill the word of the Lord. This happened to fulfill the word of the Lord, a constantly recurring theme in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, let's fast forward a little bit more. Let's say we've been in exile, but now God, as he promised, he's restored his people to come back to Israel. Think of Cyrus the Persian. He gives this edict, this declaration, they can come back to their homeland. But now they're coming back to something like a wasteland. And if there are people living there, they are not Jewish. And they're opposed to these Jewish people coming back to their homeland in Israel. They have their own set of questions. How do we set up our worship of God again? How do we rebuild the temple? What did it look like to worship God? And so the book of Chronicles is written as a history book, but now it focuses on how, not the bad news of God promising and fulfilling his promise, but the good news. Let's focus on the kings who did well. Let's focus on what good worship looks like. When you read the Chronicles, you're going to see this emphasis. They tried to please the Lord with all their hearts. And the Chronicles finishes with them coming back from exile. And so they read those books saying, okay, here's how I'm supposed to live to please God. That's a lot to absorb. And again, I'd love to spend more time. Right now, my goal is just to jog through history, give a timeline. Let me finish with a few other comments, though, here before we wrap up. We want to recognize that everybody in Jewish history, including Jesus and the apostles, the New Testament writers, they all accepted these Old Testament books as accurate. These are truly from God, right? So Jesus accepts this. He quotes from every section of the Old Testament, and he makes this claim in John chapter 10, verse 35, the scriptures cannot be broken. He makes that firm and clear claim. He tells them that heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away. And he affirms the stories like Jonah, which we'd say that's kind of miraculous. I don't know, Jonah sounds kind of mythish. Someone swallowed by a whale and regurgitated 3 days later, that's got to be like a legend. But Jesus describes Jonah as if it had actually happened. He talks about Adam, the first human made, as a historical figure, and not like a Robin Hood legend or a King Arthur legend, but an actual person. And so Jesus accepts the accounts of the Old Testament. And Paul is one of all the New Testament writers who accept this as well. It's not on the slide, but it is on the paper in front of you. Besides these, the Old Testament collection of books, this canon, that was recognized early on, like as they were being added to the collection. And we'll mention one other idea. There's a Greek translation of that Hebrew Old Testament because God's people had begun speaking Greek instead of Hebrew closer to the time of Jesus as the Greeks and the Romans took over, and so they wanted to translate it. Not everybody can understand or read the Hebrew, but we're all reading Greek now. Let's make sure we have an accurate translation in Greek, right? So the 200s, a group of scholars are commissioned to translate into Greek the whole Old Testament, and those books all match perfectly. And that's what we have today. It's called the Septuagint. Another example of God preserving his words so that we can be confident that we have it today. One last graphic that I'm going to show here to finish out. Someone tried to map out how often does the New Testament quote the Old Testament or refer to the Old Testament. And they really just enjoyed developing this, and you can imagine that the Bible cross-references itself all the time, right? So they came up with this idea. Here's how often the New Testament is quoting from the Old Testament, or the Old Testament quotes itself and references itself. And so you're going to see, some explanation. This obviously is one book. This is Genesis, and every time Genesis is referenced or cited or quoted, it shows up other places in the Bible. This is Matthew, right here. And this is a long line. Why do you think this line is so long? It's the number of verses. So I'd say this is the longest chapter in the Bible, Psalm 119 right here. But what you're seeing is this library of books we have in front of us. It's not just one added to another. It's also one cross-referencing itself and hyperlinking itself, if you will, right? This is a reminder that as God speaks, he is consistent with himself. And he quotes himself, and he doesn't change his character or his nature or his promises for his people. And so we can be thankful that I have, specifically when I open up the Old Testament, it is giving me accounts that are not recent, and yet, it is a consistent record of God's work interacting with other people. And we'll mention this more in 2 weeks. Humanity doesn't change, and God doesn't change. And so the same way that God interacts with them, I'm going to expect that I need to respond to him the same way they did or did not respond to him. We'll touch on that some more. Yeah, Andy.
1 minute to talk about why the Dead Sea Scrolls were important to like biblical critics.
Yeah, I'm probably going to take 20 minutes. And that'll come in future weeks for sure. Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, yeah, but let me just take a minute with that. So the Dead Sea Scrolls is a collection of ancient scrolls found in Qumran in modern day Israel, but they were found in 1946, if I'm not mistaken. It's in the 40s, as Israel's becoming a nation, coming out of that time period. And really fascinating story, but essentially someone stumbles across these scrolls that had been preserved in a cave. And some of these scrolls are a record of the Old Testament books, and they were copied and preserved, and they were originally copied likely before the time of Jesus. And what they found, I'll just do one example. Isaiah is the most vivid example. They found a copy of the book of Isaiah that was roughly 1,000 years older than the most recent copy of Isaiah, than the oldest copy of Isaiah that they had before. So think I have a copy of Isaiah that I'm pretty sure this matches the original Isaiah. I found a new copy that's 1,000 years older than that. Oh, let's compare the two. What they found is they're essentially identical, showing that you rewind 1,000 years, it was the exact same prophecy from the prophet, and it confirmed what we have been using and referencing before those scrolls were found. And there are many, that's the most vivid example, but it was just showing that the careful attention that people gave to God's word as they're preserving it, copying it, recording it, so we can have access to it today. Yeah, there's much more to share about that, but it's unbelievable. Anything else you were hoping to share?
No, I know it's important, but I wasn't exactly sure, like because you say the Septuagint's 200 BC,
Mm-hmm.
but our newest copies of the Septuagint weren't from 200 BC, they were from like 800s or something, is that what you're
I'll have to check that for sure. But I know it was originally translated then. And then, to be clear too, this Isaiah copy is in Hebrew, so the oldest Hebrew copy of Isaiah was more recent. So they just rewind back like, wow, this really matches exactly what the original prophet said. I can read today what God told Isaiah for his people, but also it applies to me as well. Really amazing. Yeah, we'll connect more dots in 2 weeks. Let me close our time in prayer here. God, we're just reminded again how consistently you speak, and how timeless you are and your message is. We tend to think that the last 100 years are the most important 100 years in history. And it's meaningful, of course, but we don't want to overlook centuries and millennia of human history, specifically as it relates to you and your interaction with humanity. And we thank you that what we have, we can read, we can understand and appreciate. And you can speak to us today in your word. Thank you for that. Thank you that we can worship you as our good Father in our service to come. Please receive maximum glory from us today. In Jesus' name, amen.